As we saw in the postmodern age, we went through the Cold War, the post-Cold War, the global war on terror, and now the multipolar phases, which is not so much the postmodern era now, but for example, while the war on terror period would not support the shift to the Anthropocene because of the way the whole issue arose out of the structure of the way global civilization had evolved. Now we could say that the multipolar political environment can support the shift to the Anthropocene, and that's where it's going to occur. So the biggest problem really at the moment, we could say, is that Russia had the power to act autonomously due to its permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and it would not have been able to invade Ukraine with such immunity from international law if the certain structures from postmodernity were not still in place. So the issue that we have at the moment seems to point to reform to the Security Council, as while the war on terrorism was controversial, if the US had not acted autonomously, the terrorist organizations in the Middle East would have continued to attack the West. So while it was a terrible thing, it was inherent in the way the structure of global civilization had evolved. For example, the Battle of Armageddon was talked about in the Bible. It's been the end of the world thing's been predicted for thousands of years, that the situation would come to an apocalyptic head. So now we've gone beyond that, and we have a new world order really, which is what a lot of people have been talking about, both in terms of conspiracy theories and outside of that, in terms of people that study the way the structure of global civilization moves through different phases or paradigms. We could say that the European world economy created the rules of modern capitalism, and then this created the divide between capitalism and communism, and then the two sides polarized the Middle East in terms of it being Islamic, and they wanted the Europeans out, blaming them for inflating the divide between the Sunni and the Shiite factions. But the way it happened was explosive and affected everyone, causing the global war on terror. So the UN basically found a solution to this problem in the sense that more rights and responsibilities were placed on nations for global security. And this led to the multipolar phase, as we effectively locked down that problem and stopped it from happening again. So now we're seeing the problem with the new type of nationalism that this new phase has now produced, as everything seems to have become about that. Now we see a larger nation invading a smaller one over issues which could have been resolved, but because Russia was a superpower, it was simply able to invade autonomously. Obviously, the UN organisation will be currently helping to resolve this dispute and looking where other stress points in the framework of nations lie, and may be affected by relationships between them, or between even the superpowers or the way the world works in general, as we need a global framework of governmental politics which will be strong enough to avoid the next crisis, particularly if China then chooses to go for Taiwan, and perhaps China is waiting until the Ukraine war is over before they feel it's safe to proceed. But now we're talking about the way geopolitics is evolving into the Anthropocene. Rather than postmodernity, we should now start to be talking about the way phases of postmodernity are going to turn into the phases of the Anthropocene in terms of the proportion in which the whole thing is evolving. We can see that while the war on terror brought the problem inherent in the structure of global civilization, we can see that the multipolar political environment was a solution, in the sense that there can be no excuses now for countries failing to uphold their duties on an international level. But then what about the people in the countries? In Britain, the Conservative government of the last 10 years has reduced public spending by half in order to fuel tax cuts for the super rich, perhaps as the nation itself is still required to fulfill its role as a superpower. And people just want to move forward, they just want change, they want improvement, but then you've still got this global situation. So now, do they need that much power to continue their duties on a global scale? Bearing in mind its permanent seat on the Security Council, what with conflict of interest and with nations still existing, perhaps they could not allow the people to take over in the way that they wanted to, as the people at the top all have a good understanding of the global agenda and could not tolerate socio-political change of that level. So maybe it's just all about power, but around the world people are seeing their governments embarking on extreme, what appear to be irrational courses of action simply because of how the world works, and told that they could not possibly understand. For example, houses are not being built to cope with rising populations, people are being made homeless, 1 million people in Britain are using food banks, and 6 million cannot pay their electricity bills. But all this is being disregarded as irrelevant to what is happening in the real world as the superpowers see it. So perhaps this situation involving the type of power that governments are going to need, which they could have in the postmodern age, but will the Anthropocene tolerate this type of structure? And that's why I'm predicting reform to the UN Security Council and the ability for the world to move forward in a more general sense, where governments do not see it as having to work in such a particular way. So perhaps people need to look at how the actual framework of nations themselves was created in order to see what they're actually doing as in terms of their role as part of a nation, as it was the European world economy that led to both World War I and II, and then because of that the UN framework was set up to prevent World War III. But because of the way all that happened, we've created a type of power which really has become essentially artificial, and it's not really a justifiable situation in terms of the way that it can continue, but it seems to now be continuing because of nuclear weapons themselves and the need to keep the situation under control. So because of this, we have 5 nuclear superpowers on the Security Council, but the problem with this is now that nations have seen that having nuclear power brings a reward of having some kind of superior status, and since then Pakistan, India and North Korea have all developed their own, leading to widespread calls from nations to ban them, including a vote by the UN General Assembly of Nations from around the world. But the superpowers don't want to give up their nuclear power, so perhaps it's just the new problem with the structure of global civilization as we're into the Anthropocene. And however, it can be analysed now in a different way, where we're looking at progressing forward from that rather than questioning where the situation is going to go because of that. Hence, it's not so much a battle between the world's rich and the poor right now, but a problem with the power structure, which is holding everything back, and that includes action on the environment, which we can see is simply perpetuating itself, not just since the time of the Cold War, but the whole way the structure of human civilization has evolved over time. And that is why I'm saying that people had better start talking about it now if we're going to solve the problem. Now, the Ukraine war has taken a firm grip on geopolitics, with Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons over Western involvement and people talking about World War III. So we can't go in that direction because of the way the world needs to work in a certain way if we're going to make progress according to the existing system. So nations are going to have to continue to know their place and speak out in a way which can be heard. But of course people should be talking about and looking to a broader future and looking to a long-term future, especially in terms of government analysts. So it's not just a problem with the relationship between the 5 permanent members of the Security Council now, it's a complex problem. Hopefully, as phases are now moving into the Anthropocene, this will bring new elements into the equation which we did not have before. And as the structure of global civilization had to achieve a certain end, and that was namely the point where the structure of global civilization could support the move into the new age. So consider the main problem of these phases as they've evolved over time. I know there have been other wars and humanitarian disasters, but here I'm talking about the general shape of the whole period, and the problem which emerges with each phase has an effect on changing the structure of geopolitics. So that would be the Cold War, and then the post-Cold War, and then the problem of terrorism, then the solution to this new multipolar environment. So now we have the problem of the relationship between nations, which has emerged out of this. So perhaps the next phase, if we predict that China wants to invade Taiwan, then we can see a need for the world system to hold itself together, and people preparing possibly internationally for that phase.